Hello and welcome to the Check Out This Record podcast. My name is Frank and with me is my good buddy Marc. This is the podcast where we talk about all sorts of musical goodness. We review albums we've never heard of before. We suggest albums to each other to review. We have a wide variety of musical discussions. Now you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube. If you like what we have to say, please feel free to leave us a review, and hopefully that review is a 5-star review. On the old YouTube, we are also ramping up our Check Out This Song episodes where we dig deep into our bag of songs that have influenced us. We just yap for a couple minutes, folks, so if you don't like this long format, there's a healthy alternative for you. Marc, how are you, my man, in quarantined land?
I'm doing well. I got a quarantined pizza tonight. I've had some quarantined water. Everything's pretty good.
That quarantined water sounds delicious, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And we got an interesting episode here. Like it's so packed that we can't do any top five. We can't do any fluff. It's just, to me, this is really interesting, and it's fun creating this. And this is at Marc's idea to add this other album into the mix of the Versus series. So again, we have an interesting episode, and we're going to be looking at Let It Be, verse Let It Be, verse Let It Bleed. That's right. Let It Be from the Replacements, Let It Be from the Beatles, versus Let It Bleed from the Stones. Marc, your thoughts on this? Because I think it was a great idea.
Yeah, this was interesting. I remember, you guys remember way back when Frank gave me the first Replacements album to do. Sorry, Ma, I forgot to take out the trash. And I really kind of dug it. And, we had talked a little bit about some more depth into their catalog, and this was one that stuck out. Obviously, growing up on the Beatles, I was well aware of what Let It Be was. So the fact that the Replacements had a Let It Be record, I thought was really bold of them. So I wanted to see, how it would stack up. And of course, I couldn't help but feel Let It Bleed matches in there, because to me, Let It Be and Let It Bleed from the Beatles and the Rolling Stones seem to have a couple parallels to them.
Yeah.
If only by name, but it's still in my brain that the two stuck together. And then, of course, as we dug into this, we found a little bit more of a connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are interesting albums, and I know you weren't too familiar with the Replacements Let It Be, and we always enjoy talking about the Beatles and the Stones, so hey, might as well just go ahead and do this. So, as far as these three albums, Let It Be from the Beatles is one I'd say I know the best, followed by actually Let It Be from the Replacements, and then, of course, Let It Bleed. I know this is your favorite Stones album, Let It Bleed. I like Exile on Main Street, Goat's Head Soup, and Some Girls, but Let It Bleed is just absolutely awesome. And I think the proper way to begin this, Marc, and this is my thoughts, is I figure we start with the Replacements out of these bands, because maybe the majority of the listeners out there, this is the lesser known band to them, and it just seems right to me. What about you, Marc?
Yeah, I think when you make kind of the food pyramid of music, right, it's easy to argue that the Beatles are the top, the Rolling Stones are very close to that, and that the Replacements, typically, I don't know how many conversations outside of this one you're going to hear where people compare the Replacements to the Beatles or to the Rolling Stones. So it's definitely a fun little concept here. I think it is probably best for us to start with the Replacements. Like I said, I just gave it one through when I was checking out the rest of the Replacement stuff. So to really be able to dig into it was a great bit of fun. And then, of course, comparing and contrasting it to these other records, we're in for I'm going to have a good time. I don't know if you guys are.
And listen, it's hard to go track by track. And honestly, what can you say about certain tracks like the Beatles, Let It Be, and the Stones, Give Me Shelter, that hasn't been said before? So I think it's best to do kind of an overview and what really impacted us and what sliced through the heart to leave us a lasting impression. And what I think about is the overall feeling and the vibe of the album, what we like, what we really liked, and what maybe we didn't care for. Marc, are you kind of feeling me on that one?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, cool.
You want to tell us about Let It Be, the Replacements, before we get too deep into it?
Yeah, let's do it. So Let It Be, the Replacements, released on October 2nd, 1984. Facts. This is the band's third album, with the lineup of being Paul Westerberg, Bob Stinson, Tommy Stinson, and Chris Mars. It was post-punk, I guess, with coming-of-age themes. Westerberg really wanted to take a more sincere approach after the band's first two records. The album was called Let It Be as a rib on the Replacements, or the Mats, which is a nickname for the band, their manager, who is a huge Beatles fan. And Mark, what else did you find out about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This is the immediate tie-in to us doing all three records, is that Westerberg had also said he wanted the next album to be called Let It Bleed. He saw these as albums that people viewed as sacred, right? Well, they certainly viewed the Beatles as sacred, and this is arguably one of the Stones' best complete albums. So the idea that he wanted to attack them that way, or not attack them, but to put up this comparison to these things is really interesting. He said, especially with the Beatles reference, that nothing is sacred.
Yeah.
I think fans of this podcast will know that we feel the same way. Nothing is sacred. So it was really kind of cool that, he wanted to do Let It Be as just kind of a punk rock middle finger to, hey, look, those great albums are great, but you know what? There's more great stuff out there. If I need to call this something that sounds familiar to you to get you to listen to it, well, fuck you, I will. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's, hey, this could be great also, which is cool. And this usually does rank on the top of the Replacement's best album, although I've seen some with Tim, and Tim is maybe my favorite of the bunch, but this is definitely a close second. Peter Buck of REM does the guitar solo on I Will Dare, and that very same song is the Hold Steady's Craig Finn's all-time favorite track, and that song is actually the only single from the album. Another interesting note is that this album was so inspirational that lead singer of the Decemberists, Colin Malloy, wrote a book on it. So that's pretty cool. And this album means a lot to me personally. I am realistic enough to know that we're pitting this against some powerhouses and legendary albums. And yes, on a previous episode, I said, give me the Mats Let It Be over the Beatles Let It Be. And I didn't mean that. I think this is one of the Replacements' best albums. And we're also, Let It Be, in my opinion, is a mid to lower tier Beatles record. And I love this record. But actually, as I said, Tim, I also hold in high regard as well. But I'm going to explain shortly why I love this album. So, Mark, you or me first as far as kind of getting right into then this album.
Well, I'm going to go. It's interesting. Tim is, of course, the record that would have been called Let It Bleed. Just an interesting note there. So for me, this is definitely the best Replacements record so far. I did, after listening to this and going, man, what a great record, put on Tim. I just like the way this one feels overall a little better. It's got great depth and character to it. It does feel like an 80s post-punk sound to it.
Yeah.
You can hear the tape decks. You can hear the fuzz on the amplifiers, and it's the early 80s. It's not the best recording, but the heart is there. And it really comes through in that way. I absolutely loved I Will Dare.
Yeah.
Tommy gets his tonsils out, androgynous, unsatisfied, answering machine. I liked Sorry Ma, I Forgot to Take Out the Trash, and can see how the band developed from that point, especially with songs like Tommy Got His Tonsils Out, into this record. It's interesting to me, though, because Hootenanny is such like a blatant, we're going to do something different for the sake of doing something different.
It totally is.
That if you put that album and this album, you go, how did that band get here? But if you look at Sorry Ma, I think they line up a little more than some of the people want to give them credit for when it comes to their growth and development. I see those early stages in that punk rock, and I know most of the people who were putting them down for the early stuff was them.
Yeah.
So, but hey, nobody hates you more than you do. Lord knows nobody hates me more than I do. So I just really like where this album came from, the roots of it. I could have done without the cover. I could have done without Black Diamond. And Gary's got a boner. But they were coming for a coming of age, the balance between adolescence and adulthood. So I mean, it's got its place.
Yeah.
It's definitely the song that I think I'm going to skip.
Yeah.
But I loved the earnest of this record. I like that we got loud when we needed to get loud. I love that they kept it simple when they needed to keep it simple. There was a few add-ins in terms of some outside audio added in certain places, and it was really well done. It wasn't really used as a setup. It was well integrated into the music. Dude, I love this record.
Yeah, it's good. Listen, in typical Replacements fashion, it sounds like I always refer to it as a glorious mess. I mean, you get this folky, jangly guitar, "I Will Dare" tuned with the mandolin. I mean, what punk band, which they were coined as at the time, had a mandolin going on. This goes to show you, like, it's not really the rightful place for them. There's loud, chaotic rockers, like "We're Coming Out," but even that has like this jazzy breakdown that makes you want to like finger snap at at the end of the day. Favorite thing, the song that sounds like a proper progression on the rock sound they were trying to perfect. Tommy gets his tonsils out, quick, short, snotty, and yeah, I could do without the Kiss cover too, but it's kind of edgy. You could tell Westerberg's really kind of putting some strain on the voice there, which is cool.
Yeah, they do it well, right?
Yeah.
I just didn't like the overall feel of the album. It didn't really feel necessary to me, and even like the very blatant Ted Nugent.
Yeah,
and
Gary's got a boner. Yeah,
like, hey, look, I appreciate straightforward, dumb as meat rock and roll in terms of things like Ted Nugent and the slightly classier ZZ Top. I will argue is one of the best rock and roll bands of all time.
And I agree with you on that. Yes,
this in particular, very Ted Nugent heavy. But hey, look, it's we still need to put a little snot in there. We still need to show the angst and energy of this coming of not that it's a story, but the concept of the album, the overall sound and aesthetic of it. And I think they fucking murdered it.
Yeah. You know what I think it's funny with Gary Has a Boner? They're probably writing it, and then at some point they're like, oh shit, listen, this sounds like Cat Scratch Fever. We have no choice but to give Nugent like a writing credit on this, which is what he has. So it was probably something where they're like, oh man, we just got to do it. Otherwise we're going to get, we're in our young 20s here, we're gonna get in trouble. and there's some dated stuff, I'm not gonna lie, like Senior Video. Listen, that's obviously with the MTV age going on, Answering Machine, right? It's dated. That's why I'm not the biggest fan of using things in songs such as cell phones, social media, but it's still well done. Senior Video too, there's a tribute to that the Swing Gutters do, and in one of their songs, which is pretty cool. So obviously, that it affected them as well. And I think this is an album that Paul's trying to find out like the direction of the band. Even at the young age of 25, you can tell he's cranky. He's a cranky guy in waiting. It's not the perfect mix, but I think the chaos, I think that needed to occur, right, Mark? That kind of chaos that this album has.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, especially when you take a look at it piece by piece, right? You look at Sorry Ma, you look at Hootenanny, you look at Let It Be, and even Tim, and you see the band growing and progressing and figuring out what they want to do. The only real link between Hootenanny and Let It Be is going to be Gary Has a Boner, because of that kind of Ted Nugent-y, because of that kind of straightforward rock and roll. And this, they said kind of out front, like, hey, we really did a little bit too much, too fast, too hard in Hootenanny. We want to get back to really writing songs. And they did that in this. And they did it well. And it's great because you can really see, this is a great example of a band evolving to find their sound.
Yeah, and we're witnessing it basically right there in the record, right? I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, right off the bats. I mean, too, like, again, you get a song like "We're Coming Out." That thing is so blistering fast, and then obviously Tommy gets his tonsils out after that. But then 2 songs later from "We're Coming Out" is "Androgynous," which is just him on the piano. Mm-hmm. Just go ahead and doing a ballad. So it's great. It's awkward. It's messy, but that's how I think the early mid-20s are supposed to be before like our cerebral cortex and our brain develops, so we get logical thought. So I don't know. This album it definitely works for me. Again, I'm a realist. I understand that we're stacking it up against some really powerhouses here. But Mark, I'm super actually stoked that you like this album, and we could sum it up. So what I like, and then if you just want to give a quick summary of that. So what I like is, although sloppy, I like that there's that jangly guitar sound. I think Bob Stinson's guitar work is great, and it shows that he's a very, very talented player. You dug that too?
Yeah, absolutely. The musicianship on this is great. I do like, you mentioned earlier the piano playing in Androgynous, and the way that the earnest in it, right? Like we talked last week about how Brian Fallon's album, had all these great demos out available for you to listen to on the internet that were just him and a piano, him and a guitar.
Yeah.
And this is a great example of why that works so well. No, he doesn't have a pitch perfect voice, but at the same time, he doesn't have to. Right? He's not singing about something pitch perfect. He's really delving into 1984, man.
Oof.
Being androgynous. Yeah, we saw some of that from the late 70s and David Bowie and, some of these glitter rock bands. Hair metal was really just beginning. But like early 84, or October 84, right before Frank turns 4.
Thanks.
You're welcome. That wasn't a time when we spoke openly about androgyny, right? And punk rock was seen as one of those communities where you could be different and express yourself, and the judgment wasn't quite as harsh, right? And but there was still certainly judgment there. And a band like the Replacements, with the notoriety they had, I'm sure at the time this was not seen as a gimmick song. This was seen as something serious and something progressive in a really what's the word I want to use here? A very
almost uplifting too, kind of, right? Uplifting,
sure, absolutely. It certainly cast a positive light on it, right? It put these two characters in a very sympathetic position to the listener, and really opened people up to the idea that it was okay for somebody else to be different.
Yeah,
which is beautiful. And hey, 1984. This is the cusp of all that shit that changed. That like the super conservatives are all pissed at us, but like this is the cusp. This is where people started being able to say like, hey, look, I want to be androgynous. I want to do this, that, or the other thing. I want to fuck a dude. I want to fuck a chick. I want to fuck two dudes at the same time. Whatever it is that they wanted to do, and this is one of those seeds culturally where we start turning that wheel and making these things acceptable.
Right. And, it's about, to me, listen, it all goes back to the individual. It's live and let live. And I don't think it's no surprise if you hear that I say I have a conservative nature. I'm not talking about uber conservatives. I'm talking more on a classical stance and to live and let live, not live like me or I won't let you live. And I think a lot of that is what Paul is saying, because obviously Paul is not a character in this, but he's depicting two people, individuals who, hey, listen, this is how it is. Leave him alone. Just like, hey, this is how I am. I'm a kind of weird, quirky dude, right? Leave me alone. And I think that song speaks volume, man. And
to tie it back to the album, Let It Be.
There you go. See?
Right?
That's so true.
I hear your argument of leave me alone, right? And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I think really at the heart of it, right? Like, look, these people are different. Let them be different.
Yeah.
So it's, I think this is a much smarter record than it appears on the surface.
Yeah.
I was happy to see that this thing ranks super high.
It does.
It really does. Music reviewers, with rock magazines. It's, up in the top lists of like albums from the 80s. Like, and I think deservedly, this is, for me anyways, I know Frank's been into the Replacements much longer than I have.
Yeah.
This is an example of a great band and a great record that got lost in the shuffle.
I think so, absolutely. And like I said, listen, there's some things I could do without, some of the dated natures of the song, answering machine. But I mean, things I love, man. I love like that cover alone, like just kids in their youth sitting on a rooftop. To me, that captures a moment that you're not going to get back. That cover to me just says it all. And things like I Will Dare, Favorite Thing, We're Coming Out, Androgynous, Unsatisfied. I mean, they're.
I love Unsatisfied. We didn't even touch on it.
Yeah. I mean, what a great tune.
Absolutely. And again, just earnest, awesome song. This record really is, I expected to walk in and go, yeah, absolutely, man. Rolling Stones, number 1, Beatles, Let It Be, number 2. And this thing, hey, look, that's cool, but they're not the Beatles or the Rolling Stone. And I got to tell you, I put this on and I went, holy fuck.
It's so good.
This is a great record.
Such a good album. And that song Unsatisfied too, it's Paul telling, hey, are you guys now satisfied with the music I'm making now, which is so good. And it's there's repetition to it, but it's so poignant the way he does it, and just such a good album. Years ago, the Replacements were nominated for potential Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I know that doesn't mean much, but I hope someday they get the credit they deserve. Who knows if they'll ever get back? They got back for a while, then they imploded again like normally they do. But Mark, I'm super amped that you love this record, man.
Yeah, no, this thing was rad, man. Let's jump into the lesser known "Let It Be" record by the
Beatles. Oh man, so Let It Be, the Beatles, right? Released on May 8th, 1970. We know the lineup, right, Mark? We don't have to say who the lineup is.
Yeah, it was
Georgie,
Paulette, Jonathan. I can't come up with anything else for Ringo.
Yeah, Richard Starkey. There you go.
Yeah, there you go, Richard Starkey. Hey, look, but you pointed out last album before the breakup, but this was actually recorded before Abbey Road.
It's so interesting. So it's the 12th and final album released after the breakup, but Abbey Road was written after this, but released before, and then this record came out. So that's largely due to the band's turmoil at the time. It was a chaotic mess. McCartney wanted this project as a return to rock and roll roots, and the rehearsals were filmed. You have Get Back, Let It Be, and The Long and Winding Road, backed with For You Blue, Harrison's song, were the singles. Most lists does have this as a mid-lower tier album, and as far as the ranking goes, that doesn't mean anything, but I'm just pointing that out. And Phil Spector produced the final mix of this record, which also caused a little controversy. I don't think we need to get into any certifications of this album. We know every Beatles record, right, Mark, is hugely successful. I mean,
right. Yeah.
So like all the other Beatles records, though, it has a unique presence, and there's these cool backstories. This one's to no exception. When I was getting into the guitar and learning from Beatles songs, I found this cool book at a bookstore titled Beatles Songs, all one word. And what's cool about it is it talks about little-known facts from each song, the album, who played what on each track, and my favorite, which is the percentage and authorship of each tune. So there's some interesting quotes. If you don't mind, I won't be too long here, Mark, but I just wanted to
get into it.
About this album. This is from George Martin, the normal producer. Said right from the beginning, everything about Let It Be seemed to be out of sync with what we had done before. It was not at all a happy recording experience. It was a time when the relationships between all the Beatles were at the lowest of their ebb. Lennon, who always had a good sense with turning phrases here. Someone mentioned the Colosseum in Rome, and I think originally Paul might have even suggested a bloody boat in the middle of the ocean. As for me, I was rapidly warming up to the idea of an asylum. which is pretty interesting. So obviously all had something to say about the vibes of this record. Paul was really driving the ship here, but the ship is tougher to steer when everyone is at their wits' end with the overall mania and frankly probably each other. I mean, the album cover alone, Mark, I mean, it's black, had a funeral feel to it, and all the Beatles are in their own separate kind of squares and pictures. You kind of get that same vibe, right, Mark, with this album?
Yeah, I love that you brought up the cover and that the separation of them, the fact that they were all individuals. We were no longer part of that big piece as we saw on previous records. So it was an interesting thing. Of course, the album released after they broke up, so it's you're not exactly going to get them to sit down for a photo shoot.
No.
But I think it speaks in a way to a little bit of the chaos of the record, which why to me the most fascinating thing is that Abbey Road came after this in terms of writing it.
Right.
Is that this doesn't feel finished?
No, feels incomplete.
Right. And it's almost as though somebody went like, hey, we got those tapes. They owe us another record. Let's just put it out.
Maybe. Right. Absolutely. And maybe that's what we're hearing too. And maybe that's why there's those inconsistencies. And a couple other quick quotes is, Lennon saying it was hell making the film Let It Be. It was the most miserable session on earth. McCartney said Let It Be was very sticky. Harrison said I couldn't stand it. So, I mean, that's all we need to know. However, it's still a widely successful Beatle record,
Yeah, well, I mean, hey, look, they had a hard time putting out anything that people wouldn't just immediately buy. And that was part of the problem they had with themselves, right? Was that they wanted to put out the best music possible.
Yep.
And hey, maybe that's why, this wasn't released before Abbey Road. You know,
Absolutely.
so there's some things to be said there about this. You know, I get why this falls low as far as Beatles album lists go.
Right, you
Right?
get it. It makes sense, right?
Yeah. To me, it's still better than the early stuff with like you know, like Up to Help. I just don't love early Beatles, but that's me.
Yeah.
Hey, look, you know, I said it before. I think, you know, on the food pyramid of bands, the Beatles are pretty far at the top, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to argue otherwise, but this is definitely that lower part of the pyramid. You know, there are some of the tracks that really fall short on this album. And one of the hardest things about this is the opening of this record.
Talk
Two
to me
of
about
us.
it. Yeah, talk to me about that.
Not how I want to get into a record, right? You know, because it's like starting a record at couples therapy, right? Like it's, hey, look, guys, this is bad. This thing is going to be bad, you know. So it's a rough way to really just get the ball rolling
That's
in
so funny.
terms of an album, you know. So right out of the gate, you've got these problems, right? I mean, like we can agree that's like you're just like, oh, what is going on here? Wait a minute. Especially like Dig a Pony is next. And like Dig a Pony to me is one of the great songs. You know, there's that classic rooftop performance of it.
Yeah.
It really kind of holds this cool special place for the band because it's like, right, that was their last live performance. But you juxtaposition that song Two of Us to Dig a Pony and you're like, why the fuck did you open this album to Dig a Pony? You know, anyways, you know, Maggie May, you're just like, One After 909. You're like these songs just like just very middle of the road. These are the songs that don't feel complete, that don't have that kind of Beatles quality to them. But of course, you know, they're balanced by songs like Dig a Pony, Across the Universe, and Let It Be. Now, mind you, I've only named 7 of the 12 songs on this record.
Right.
The rest of the songs are just bad. Not necessarily bad. They literally do nothing. You know, they're ideas that came up, they finished them, and instead of reshaping them and polishing them, they just went, hey, it's on the track. You know, so really, it's a tough record, man, because especially when a band of this quality, you know, like I said, it feels unfinished. You know, but that said, when it's great, it's great. You know, particularly Across the Universe and Let It Be. Dig a Pony is a cool song. I really, you know, the aesthetic of it, it's definitely not their best songwriting. It's definitely not the height of Beatles quality when it comes to songwriting and arrangement. You know, I think with a band like this, we got to hold everything they do to that top tier quality.
Yeah.
And this doesn't hold up. So to me, it's really interesting that, and who knows why, you know, the Replacements manager loved this record so much. Maybe it was just like, hey, look, we're going on tour. This is the one tape I brought with me. So they were using that to fuck with him.
Yeah.
You know, because I not call it Abbey Road or to not call it Sgt. Pepper's, you know, whatever. It's an interesting choice to pick this album name.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. What did you think, Frank?
So I have a lot of similarities, but also there are a couple of things I'm going to take a different opinion on, of course,
Sure.
if you don't mind. So
I mind.
Oh, I know you do. So in the midst of the anger and the turmoil, you know, the opening track, you said, you're like, oh, how'd they open it with that? That's actually one of my favorite Beatles songs.
I don't see it. I mean, like,
so I'll tell you why. There's some feelings. There's some feelings involved in it. It does, you know, evoke some special feelings to me that were personal, which obviously a lot of people relate to when they listen to a song. But I think it's because I like a lot of the lesser known Beatle tracks as some of my favorites. I think it's one of those unheralded ones. I like the harmony that Paul and John have, and I like musically that actually George is playing the bass notes on the guitar, which is cool. Now, here's what I like about it, and this is just my opinion, but it could be an opinion of somebody else, which I'll tell you about. So I know it's about Paul and Linda because that's around the time, you know, he met and married his first wife, Linda. However, I always viewed it as being about Paul and John and their eventual riding off into the sunset. So you get this last album, technically their last album as far as the release date goes, and the opening
Mhm.
track is really, we hear Paul and John, two of us, and to me it's summarizing kind of everything they've been through, and that's kind of it right now. And what's funny is there was actually a made for TV movie called Two of Us where it talks about Paul visiting John, hypothetically, which I believe he did in his New York apartment anyway, but on this particular weekend in 1975, and the discussions they had, the arguments they had, and all of those things. Well, I mean, it's a great concept, but it was such poor acting, though. So unfortunately, that kind of put a damper on it. But I always viewed that song. What I liked about it is that, to me, this was Paul and John saying, "Hey, this was us, and now we're kind of riding off to the sunset." So maybe it was a deeper connection I had for that song. You mentioned "Dig a Pony" that you like, which is funny. I always skipped over it because in that same book, Lennon coined it as another piece of garbage, which is, Lennon's. He was always his own worst critic, and Harrison's "I Me Mine" is not too far from that. You brought up a good point with One After 909. I think they dug that one out of the trenches because if you listen to the Beatles Anthology Volume 1, there's an early version of this song. This is a tune that they were playing in the late 50s and the early 60s live. And there's a really cool outtake on a side note of Paul having to stop, and you could hear the audio of him and John and someone else, I forget who, chatting, that he's just exhausted. He's like, I've been playing this song forever and this whole weekend and blah, 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 blah. And he's winded, and it's just a cool little parlay back and forth. But yeah, One After 909, just, it's like, hey, they needed another song. Let's pick this one that we had here from the early days. You're right, Mark. Let It Be is a classic. I like Long and Winding Road too, but I always viewed it as like Let It Be's little annoying brother. I think Spector ruined it with the overproduction, and Paul definitely cited Spector's production value as a frustration in the book.
It feels like
Right?
the Diet Coke version of Let It Be.
Yeah.
Right? If Let It Be is Coke with sugar in it, Long and Winding Road is Let It Be with whatever fake sugar additives you're using instead of sugar. Like I get that.
Yeah. And what's interesting too is that its placement. Like I remember listening to this album, fully for the very, very first time many years ago, and I was like, all right, cool. We got Let It Be. That's kind of the slow ballad in between, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 tracks later, with Maggie May not really being a track, you get Long and Winding Road. I'm like, oh, another one, another slow one.
Yeah. Well, and especially because you really could have end capped this record with it. I
Yes.
like Get Back at the end. I don't know why that skipped my notes for some reason.
Get Back is great.
It's great. Like it very much fits what Paul wanted to do with that rock and roll feel and sound of this record. It brings you back to what you love about the Beatles, right? That up tempo, really positive, really like not positive, but like really energy charge. But I think if you slide Long and Winding Road after that as the farewell to this record and really the band,
I like that idea.
I think it works better.
I mean, they should have called us back then. I don't know what the hell they were thinking.
Yeah, I mean,
What's cool about Get Back is it's another staple, and it's you get the legendary rooftop performance of that song, but it's another song with that mystique, because there was always speculation that Paul's telling that Get Back message is really to Yoko, saying, hey, listen, get back, get away from the sessions, stop doing that. So whether it is about that or not, it's interesting to say. You get Billy Preston on the electric piano, which is spot on playing. Lennon always coined it as a better version of Lady Madonna, which is funny. 2 tracks, just I want to briefly mention that I think are always underlooked, is Across the Universe. I think that's one of Lennon's actually best tunes, from the opening guitar riff to the insightful and introspective lyrics. I think it left an impression on me that it's a great nighttime kind of cosmic, delicate ballad. I think it gets underlooked, I'm sorry, in Lennon compositions, because I think it's a good tune. And one I've always liked too is I've Got a Feeling, and I like it because it's actually one of the few later tracks that has 50% authorship going to Paul and John, and you get Paul's kind of optimistic verses and John adds that layer that showcases the more pessimistic side in life. So I have always liked I've Got a Feeling. Mark, before I guess we wrap up, Let It Be, the Beatles record. Did you like I've Got a Feeling too? Because you didn't touch base on that one.
It's kind of one of the songs that floats in the middle. It's not a bad song. It's not a great song.
Yeah.
To me, it just felt like, this is one of those songs that could use a little more,
Oomph.
a little more oomph. Yeah, a little more chili powder in the bowl. It just always kind of felt like, there could be a little more to this. And I agree with you across the universe. I feel like it's because it's on this record, it doesn't quite get the notoriety that maybe it would have had if it were on a different album. Although they did make that movie
Across the Universe, yeah,
across the universe with it. Using it as the plot, right, or the device, the plot device for that film. And of course, Bono ruins everything. But and like I will agree with you though, a great job of setting up aesthetic, great job setting up atmosphere.
Yeah.
You really feel that nighttime, staring at the universe feeling, listening to Across the Universe. It's definitely one of the better songs on this record. Although for me, it just doesn't have that. I don't have that emotional attachment
right
to it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, listen, what I like, hey, listen, it's a Beatles record. It's legendary. They all have their unique sound. You get some really great songs. What I could do without, I think, Mark, you feel the same way. The throwaway song, it's not the throwaway songs. It's not the length of them. I mean, Abbey Road, we get all these smaller, shorter, intertwined songs at different lengths, but they were just good. And the production value, I don't think, on this is good. To me, what I love is Two of Us. I know Mark had different feelings on that, but that's totally cool. I've Got a Feeling and Across the Universe. Mark, anything you want to add?
No, I think, you made an interesting argument for the songs that you like on this record. As we know, I'm right and you're wrong.
Absolutely. I go, and just so you know, I go into everything knowing that. So
no. Hey, look. It's a Beatles album, right? There's great stuff with this record. I think this definitely shows that turmoil that was going on in the band, and why it was such a difficult time for them. And it's certainly, juxtaposition with the fact that Abbey Road was written and presumably recorded after this, but released before it.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But hey, I'm happy we got Abbey Road out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, Mark, I don't know if you remember this, but our road trip when we went to see the Revival tour, I took about 10 albums on it, and Abbey Road was one of them. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah. Listeners, it's only like a 2-hour drive.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. So
it was the day of, it was still the day of a CD book, so it's totally acceptable.
Yeah. It was 4 hours.
Totally.
4 hours, by the way. All right, so we've done Let It Be twice, and now we get to Let It Bleed by the Rolling Stones. So it released December 5th, 1969. It is the 8th British and 10th American studio album. I always hated that. Anyway, so the lineup here, we get Jagger, Richards, Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, Brian Jones, replaced by Mick Taylor. So there's a time of turmoil during this as well. Brian Jones, the founder and original member, I'll get to that in a second, became just unreliable in the studio. He was fired in the midst of the sessions and replaced with Mick Taylor. Brian died 2 months before the album's release. Mark, quick thoughts on always this Brian Jones being heralded as like the original leader of the band. Listen, I mean, it's the Rolling Stones. It's like when I think of leaders, I think of Jagger, obviously, then his relationship with Richards. Did you ever have any beef with, Brian Jones always being heralded as the original leader of the band?
So, the Rolling Stones are a band that took me a long time to really appreciate. And I have to tell you, I don't know about Jones being the leader. I just don't know that. For me, the band got way better from this record on. Perhaps he laid the foundation in Beggar's Banquet. That's definitely a cool record. I don't think it holds a candle to this record. But this, for me, is where the Stones hit their sweet spot. I mean, you're talking about this record, then you get right into
Sticky Fingers.
Right into Sticky Fingers.
Oh.
And then Exile on Main Street. Those three records, arguably the best work the band had ever done collectively. Those 3 records back to back to back. So was his leadership, an essential thing to get them to this point? Maybe. But in a band, who is the leader? Who's doing what? And clearly with him out of the picture, and I hate to say that because he did die before they got into the studio for the next record, but
right.
It clearly we're better off with somebody else as a leader. So
right. Yeah.
I hate to be a dick because the guy's dead to argue. I mean, like he couldn't have made an argument otherwise. He didn't start another band. This isn't a Joe Strummer and Mick Jones situation,
right?
Where Mick Jones started another band, and it was just kind of like, oh, people are like, oh yeah, big audio dynamite, yeah, okay, those 2 guys needed to be together. The Stones were able to march on successfully, if not more successfully than they had ever had. So
yeah,
that's kind of how I want to lazily answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only reason why I bring it up, because it's always something that irked me, because you're right, a band is a band. Everyone has their own part. Who's the leader? I mean, I guess there's a leader as far as like, maybe someone taking more of a charge in the studio, like kind of McCartney did in later Beatle records. But to me, when they single out someone who doesn't do the lead vocals as the leader, like they do in what's that band? Remember Fall Out Boy? It's like, oh, the guitar, the bass player is the leader. That to me is insecurity. That to me is, hey, look at me. Just so you know, Jagger may be singing, but I'm the real leader here. That's always my little funny little kind of quirk about that.
Yeah, for what it's worth, no, I don't remember Fall Out Boy.
I think they still.
I remember that people liked them. I don't give a fuck, and I never have.
I know, dude. I know. So this is widely considered one of their best albums in their top 3 to 5 on some lists. Keep in mind that's interchangeable. Again, as Mark mentioned, we have Beggar's Banquet before and after. I mean, we have Sticky Fingers, Exile Main Street. Wow. I mean, just what a run. The band took a more blues-based approach with their inspiration, as the inspiration was American roots music from gospel, country, and of course the blues. So Mark, I'm gonna actually give this to you to start off because I know it's your favorite Stones record. So I want to give it to you to start.
Yeah. So this is, Frank said it, hands down my favorite album. Give Me Shelter right out of the jump. How many times have Frank and I annoyed you with, the first track of an album is really important. This is such a great way to kick off, just right out of the jump. It's an amazing opening to the album. Mick is quoted as saying he wrote this song while watching a rainstorm as he came down from coke and heroin on his buddy's couch. Right? The Vietnam War is just starting.
Yep.
He's seeing this storm as a metaphor for what's going on. He's fucking using heroin. Like, he needed some shelter. He needed protection from everything that was going on. And it came across really, really just as a wild opening to this. Did we mention the only single from this record?
Yes. Yep. It's Let It Bleed. Silver. Yeah, Let It Bleed / You Got the Silver. And that's crazy considering the hits on here and considering every song really at the end of the day could be a single.
Yeah. And honestly, You Got the Silver and Let It Bleed, for what it's worth, are probably like the 2 weakest songs on the record, particularly You Got the Silver. But it's just crazy to me. Love in Vain, Country Honk, Live With Me. Then you get the title track, Let It Bleed, which is a great song. I just think that when you look at the performance of these songs, their dedication to the blues rhythms, Charlie Watts is, a timing machine. That man's never been wrong with a rhythm in his life.
No, man. So steady. So steady.
Hell of an A-side of a record, dude.
Yeah.
The B-side, Midnight Rambler, that song's classic. You know what I mean? Like, then you get the Silver, which again for me is probably the low light on the record, but it's still not a bad song.
Right. Low light's not a bad thing on this record.
Right. Sorry, I lost my place. Then you get Monkey Man, right, which is just a cool song. And the last songs you don't always get what you want.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't.
Fuck, man, like. This might be like, for me personally, when we talk about rock and roll, this is a top 5 album. Like, this is the best of rock and roll at its bluesiest, at its kind of dirtiest at its, like, hey, we need to say something about the world. It's 1969 on a record. Give Me Shelter touching the Vietnam War and all the changes going on. To Let It Bleed and what they're trying to the feelings within the song Let It Bleed about allowing yourself to move on. Really just kind of crazy just how good this fucking record is,
I
man.
know, man.
I'm going to shut up now. What did you think of Let It Bleed?
So what's really cool about this, and I love how we could take kind of parallels to these classic albums and kind of tie them in together. So, listen, you got Give Me Shelter right off the bat. This absolute rocker, which is really, I mean, you could take it and equate it to kind of any time and to kind of any certain feeling. Obviously, Marc really nailed it on the head. It's 1969 in a nutshell for you. But what's cool is then right after that, right, you get this tune Love in Vain, which is originally from the Delta blues singer Robert Johnson. But what they did is they took some of the structure and they added more chords to it. They made it more country, which is cool. And two things what I liked about that progression from Give Me Shelter to Love in Vain is it reminded me of in the Clash London Calling, where you have London Calling and then bam, right after that was a cover of Brand New Cadillac, right? Boom, right there. Kind of setting a cool tone. Same here. Give Me Shelter, then boom, this Robert Johnson who Keith Richards loved, absolutely loved. You get this Love in Vain, which is cool. And I love when bands who are not from the areas where the music they love, they're not from those areas, and they play tribute to it, like a British band doing American country or Delta blues, or like someone I always told you this too offline, Marc, like someone from the Northeast doing kind of folk. I like that. I really, really do like that because it adds a different element to it. Let It Bleed. I mean, listen, they're hitting their stride here. I think you coined it. You said Beggars laid that foundation. Let It Bleed started putting the cylinder blocks around what would be the house, right? The flaws are it really work to their advantage because there's like a lack of tone and flavor, but those occurrences don't matter because this is what I always say. Are the songs good, right? This is not, I Me Mine or Maggie May or One After 909. This is stellar track. Still, Let It Bleed is still a good song. Midnight Rambler, and although there's moments of repetition, man, I mean, they're almost arousing, Country Honk, which is the country version of Honky Tonk Woman, is welcome to me and for some reason when I saw them live and they did Honky Tonk Woman, I didn't like it live. I don't know why. That's not saying anything bad about it. I just didn't care for it. But I like Honky Tonk, and then of course a lower point. You got the Silver. Richards is kind of creating his own Dylan persona here, but hey, man, that's kind of what it is. I don't know, Marc. I think every song could be a single on this. You get that cool opening bass line on "Live with It." Jagger nails so many of these things vocally and sonically, absolutely great. And of course, the closer, you can't always get what you want. Again, I don't think that's a tune we need to go into. It's a classic. I mean, what a great album, man.
Yeah, and it's for me. This is I'm speaking just about the Stones here. Yeah, and it's one of my arguments with bands, right? Especially when you have as many records as the Rolling Stones have, right? Is that many records, you're bound to have, arguably 3 records worth of songs that are good. So somewhere in the ballpark of, let's say the average album has 12 songs. We're talking like 36 good songs. And I'm pretty sure the Stones are somewhere at like 400 songs or something.
Yeah.
Like that, right? This record doesn't have filler.
No.
Like the only one to me is possibly You Got the Silver. Right? And it's not a bad song. It just doesn't live up to Monkey Man. It doesn't live up to the rest of this album, right? So it's just a really interesting thing. I think when you look at Beggar's Banquet, you look at Sticky Fingers, with Wild Horses on it, which is a phenomenal song. There's a little more filler on that record. There's a little bit more filler on
Exile Main Street too. Are you
on
thinking?
Exile? Yeah, just in that every song doesn't hit the way every song hits on this record.
Right.
And that, to me, that's my argument for why this is their best album. But it's just crazy. Like, what a record. And, for a band like the Replacements to go, well, we're going to do this record, and we're going to call it Let It Be as like a middle finger. We can do what we want. And the fact that he was propositioning the idea of, then we're going to call the next one Let It Bleed. Like,
I know.
that's really cool to me, for him to be like, look, we're really going to step it up and compare it to what people consider the highest regards of this art form that we're doing. Comparing ourselves to a Beatle record, comparing ourselves to a Stones record, that takes balls, it takes gusto, and this is a record with balls in it. So who's to say why they named that album Tim and not Let It Bleed? That's not for me to say. But for me, I break down this verses like this. Let It Bleed, from the rant you just heard me go on. The Replacements, Let It Be. I really got into this record. Great album to put on and just sit with. Really, like, put on some headphones, pull up, Google the lyrics for it, get into it. It's a great record, and it really belongs exactly where it existed. And the arguments for this being one of the best records of the 80s, I think, are warranted. Certainly probably the best post-punk record. I'd be open to an argument that there's a better post-punk record than this,
right?
Because it's just a phenomenal record. I truly get the hype for the Replacements. I didn't necessarily understand it before. I got it. Which leaves for me the Beatles in third place.
Yeah.
Which is crazy because it's the fucking Beatles. But if we're calling records for what they are, this isn't their best work. It's not close to their best work.
Right.
When you're arguing, one of the best bands of all times. Yep. All the records need to hold that certain standard. And this one, as I said, doesn't feel finished, doesn't live up to that standard set by things like Abbey Road, the White Album, Sgt. Pepper. To me, this feels like a less stoned Yellow Submarine.
Ah, very interesting.
Just in that it doesn't have that completed form to it. It doesn't have the whimsy, right? That Magical Mystery Tour or Yellow Submarine had. So I get when people say like, oh, that's kind of one of the lower Beatles albums. I think they're right.
Yeah.
I still think the Replacements had every right to use this record as a fuck you. If they had called this the White Album, if they had called it Abbey Road, right? Would it have compared as well as it did against Let It Be? Maybe not.
Right.
But certainly a bold choice. Bold choice.
Yeah.
What'd you feel, Frank?
So, I kind of go two ways about this. And the first is the one that I personally like the best, which is the Replacements, Let It Be. I'm not saying it's better than the other two, or really Let It Bleed. But to me, it hit me at a time when I liked the loud rocking. And Mark, we were, in constant communication during those times too, roughly probably about, I don't know, maybe 10, 11 years ago. To me, it hit me at a time when, I liked the loud rocking punk vibe songs, but I was also looking for how you could marriage that and balance it by tunes that were more intimate, not soft, but intimate with some edge, Yeah, there's goofy and silly, corny moments, but, you can always skip over those tunes. I Will Dare is one of my all-time favorite tunes and really puts this record in that list for me. With great influence. Now, the Beatles' Let It Be is not bad by any means. It's just too much of a mishmash, though. They were in business for themselves. They were arguing, and I think that was the result of this. Now, of course, previously released and post-preliminary recorded Abbey Road has a mix too, but again, the songs were way better. Let It Be to me is just a Beatles record that will always be lower tiered. It's not Beatles for Sale or with the Beatles, the early stuff, but it's definitely not the White Album or or Abbey Road. Now, Let It Bleed. Now, this is where I said it's kind of, I fall into two paths on this. Let It Bleed, I believe, is the best album out of the three, hands down. I mean, this is the peak for a band that already had a track record and was really rewriting that success and creating new and uncharted success. The qualities of the songs are just here, it's unmatched. So to me, I'm saying Replacements, Let It Be is my favorite, but really the best album out of these, if this all makes sense to anyone, is Let It Bleed.
I think that's fair enough. And I think, hopefully people understand what we're saying here in this, Let It Be versus Let It Be versus Let It Bleed. How do you compare anything to the Beatles? Right?
Yeah. I mean, how?
At the end of the day, you're comparing the Beatles against themselves, and that, does this catch up with that? And I think these two particular records to this particular Beatles record really did. I remember not understanding when I was younger, when people were like, you're either a Stones guy or a Beatles guy. And I was like, what Stones record keeps up with a Beatles record? Here you go, man. Like honestly, it's one of those things that, like, it's hard to, it's hard to argue against when you really set them out and look at them. For me, Let It Bleed's probably the most of these three, the most difficult record to really sit through.
Yeah.
Because it meanders a little bit, because it doesn't have that finished, polished sound you expect out of a Beatles record. You're not anticipating the next song. You're kind of going like, all right, I know there's something I like coming up.
Yeah, you're like, I'm just anticipating it. I'm waiting.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely interesting. And as the years pass and you get more into that whole kind of debate, Beatles and Stones, leave the Replacements out for a minute. I think it's super hard because the Stones kept going. The Stones have 4 times the amount of music and records that the Beatles have. I don't know how fair of a comparison that is anymore. I mean, you get to some albums down the road from the Stones, like Some Girls. I mean, that's also heralded as one of their best records as well. And I mean, just the Beatles were non-existent at the time, so it's a tough call, though. But three great records at the end of the day, 3 awesome, I think, experiences, and I had a blast listening to them. So.
Yeah, so there was one thing I wanted to mention just while we were talking about the Beatles and Abbey Road versus Let It Be, is that George Martin is credited as the sole producer on Abbey Road.
Yes.
Whereas we had
Phil Spector.
Right? And Phil Spector is not a bad producer. He's a horrible person.
Yes. Totally.
But he's a good producer. But I think this speaks a little more when people ask, well, why don't these, the kind of the mix and mash between those two records, why is one so much better than the other? Obviously, right, song choice is one thing. But look at a key role like the producer who's going to, and then follow up and mix and master the record.
Yeah.
George Martin understood the Beatles in a way that Phil Spector couldn't.
Yeah.
Right? He knew the records that George Martin was done with, but he didn't know the Beatles.
George Martin was their guy. I mean, that was their guy.
Absolutely.
He knew the Beatles, man.
Yeah. And, the interviews with him where he talks about what was really going on in the studio are phenomenal, because he's really as unbiased as any member of the Beatles can be.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting, hey, look, I still love the Beatles. I think they're a great band. Look at his stuff when you're looking up Beatles stuff to really get kind of more, not an honest look at it, but an independent view.
Yeah.
Right. To get that feel to it. So I had a blast doing this. I thought this was a great little fun little verse. If you guys have recommendations for us, whether it's albums, whether it's you've got an idea for a verse that you think would be fun.
Yep.
If you just want to make Frank listen to Ted Nugent records, feel free to find us on Instagram, find us on YouTube. Yep. Frank, are we on the Twitter?
Yeah, we are also on the Twitter at Checkout Record. So please, like I said, Mark said, just hit us up for any time you have a suggestion. We will be
Yeah.
more than willing. I'm sorry, the Twitter's at Check Record, so you can tell how often I go there. But it's at Check Record.
Yep. I don't
Twitter.
tweet at all, so.
There you go. Instagram, which Mark manages, YouTube, of course. And let's talk about the next episode real quick, Mark.
Yeah, what are we doing next week? I think you're picking a record for me, right?
Yeah, so we're gonna get back to the rock or whatever you want to coin this particular version of it. But I'm talking about the band from New Brunswick, New Jersey. That's Thursday. Thursday is a band who I got into in the early 2000s. They had really some impactful records at the time. One was called War All the Time, which I think was really, really good. And that one followed Full Collapse. Full Collapse came out in 2001, which was a big hit for them. It had very popular singles such as Understanding in a Car Crash and Cross Out the Eyes. War All the Time I really, really dug. And then they came out with a little bit of an experimental album in 2006 called A City by the Light Divided. It's their fourth album. It's actually released on Island Records, so that is a major label release. And then it's released in 2006. I think you get a good mix here. Lead singer Jeff Rickley, I think he always does a great job at painting imagery and what he's trying to talk about. There's some loud rock songs. There's some screaming sections. There's some really delicate moments on this too. And I know we talked about Thursday, and I think you're more familiar with War All the Time and Full Collapse, Mark, but I wanted to throw this record at you and see what you thought.
I probably couldn't name a Thursday album.
There you go.
If you hadn't done it. They're one of those bands that I knew people were listening to, but it never did enough to pull me in. Hey, look, we're gonna see where this road goes.
Could be a long and winding road, right?
It could. I could just let it be. But so it should be interesting. This is again one of those bands that I just kind of knowingly passed on. Should be interesting to see what the hype's about.
Cool, man. Cool. I hope you dig it. If you don't, hey, we're going to talk about it, and everyone knows we will hear about it, right, Mark?
we sure will hear about it. That's for sure.
Cool. Well, everyone, again, you can find us on a multitude of different avenues and channels. Again, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify. Leave us a review, 5-star review, of course, and leave us a suggestion. We are totally cool people. We want to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
You usually don't have to tell people you're cool.
I know.
It's all right.
I know. We'll talk about that offline, though.
Have a good night, guys. Thanks for listening.
All right, guys. Be well.
Bye. Bye-bye.